So I'll take a minute and I want to walk around my island. And in order to do that, I need to go into my standard assets folder, into the character controller folder, and drag out a first person controller. Now, if you don't have your character controller listed in your standard assets, or you don't have a standard assets folder, it's probably because you didn't select that package when you established the project. And that's no big deal because you can always import it after the fact. If you go to assets, you can say import package, and all of these packages that are listed here are the contents that was available to you in the project wizard. So you can just select character controller. After it imports, you'll have access to this. And so with my character controller folder selected, I'll go into the asset view here, and I'll click and drag the first person controller out. And I'll place it roughly where the start of my island should be. Now remember, we can fall through our island, so I'm going to look at this from a side view. With the first person controller selected, I'll tap the F key, which is frame, and I can see that if I look really closely, I can see that a couple things are happening. First of all, I'm in the water. I don't want that. But I can also see that my first person controller is actually submerged in the water. So chances are it's going to fall through that map. So I'll just lift it up a little bit to where I can see the bottom, and that green outline represents the collider, or the surface with that's going to detect other surfaces, and I want to make sure that that's above it because otherwise it'll fall straight through. I'll look at the top-down view, and it looks like I'm actually in a good position, so I can just move this and start it right about here. I'll go back to the perspective view by clicking on this widget, and I'll reorient my view, and I'll zoom out just a little bit. So at this point, when I hit the play button, I'm falling through the ground. So maybe I didn't move that up high enough. So I'll just move it up a little bit higher and hit the play button. And I could tell I was falling through the ground because I didn't land on this surface. Now, in looking around, it seems like a reasonable size, and I'll walk over to this bay, and I can look across the bay and I see the other side of the island. That looks pretty good. And I'll just kind of take a walk over here, and you can see I don't really have a clear sense of what the actual scale or what the distance is that I traveled. And but I can start to see that I'm coming up. I feel like I'm coming up on where the bay starts to round off, and I can take a right here. And so this size feels pretty good because it takes me a little while to walk around this bay area, but it's not so big that I'll be walking all day to get around it. Now what I could also do, I'll just toggle the play button. I held Command P to turn off the play button, and remember, when I hit the play button with the mouse, I want to make sure I turn it back off because any change that I make inside my environment, so if I'm running my simulation and I go over here and I play with some assets or I modify some properties, when I toggle this play button off, any change that I make is going to snap back to what it was when the game engine was off or when the simulation was not running. What I could do is, if I want to get a better sense of what this scale is, I can actually split out the scene in the game view. So we have the game tab here, and this is the tab that comes forward when we hit the play button and we run our simulation. You can see that our game tab comes forward, and so we're focused on that. So not only are we focused on the game engine or the game scene, but the simulation is running and lets us interact with it. I'm going to hold down Command P to toggle the play button off. I'm just going to click and drag and peel that tab off and nest it. You'll see when I get close to the right side here, it kind of snaps. And just for a short bit, I'll look at this through a split view. So I have my scene view over here, and I have my game view over here. And what this will allow me to do is when I hit the play button, so I'm looking through my scene, and of course over on the left side of the window, I can see what my scene view is. And so the reason I'm doing this is because I get a much better sense of what the scale is for my island. And so now I have a very different sense of it, where I thought I was rounding the bay, and in fact I might have been rounding the bay, but it feels like it's taking me a much longer time to get there. So at this point, I really might want to make the decision to make my map a little bit smaller, or make it as interesting as possible, so if it takes me this long to get from point A to point B, there should be some interesting stuff going on. So at this point, I don't have any plans for a system to teleport from one location to the other, even for production, but maybe that could be something that plays into the story of my map. But for now, I didn't spend a whole lot of time on my map, and now is a good time to make some decisions about the size of it. I felt like it took a kind of a long time to move around. So what I'll do is I'll just go back into my terrain, go back into the settings, and I'll reduce this setting. Now, we don't want to, I'm just going to reduce it down to 800 by, say, 600. Now, we don't want to do this after we've spent a lot of time on our map, because I don't know if you noticed, but I might have scaled this disproportionately, and it kind of made some things a little wonky in here, at least in terms of their scale and their proportion. And that's okay, because I need to go back in and spend a lot of time kind of refining these edges and changing the size of some of this stuff. So that's okay, but what you don't want to do is you don't want to spend a tremendous amount of time working on your map and then deciding things are too small and scaling it down, because then your terrain is going to be really disproportionate and kind of strange looking. So at this point, what I'll do is I'm fairly satisfied that that's going to be the right size, but if I want to test it again, I'll just use this trick of splitting out my view here, hit play. I didn't make it too much smaller, but you can see I'm falling through my terrain. So just by moving that terrain or resizing it or scaling it, I'm kind of in the wrong place. So I'm just going to zoom in. I'll grab the move tool. I'll look at this from a top-down view, and I'll just click and drag and move that over. Now I want to hit the play button. Walking around, I'll just kind of reframe this. It still feels a little big, but I think that once I start getting more information and points of interest into the scene, I think that'll feel right, because we don't want the island so small that it doesn't feel like we can't move around it. But again, I really want to kind of dial in that decision at this point in terms of the size. I think that feels pretty good. So the other thing that I'm going to do really quickly before I move on to the next phase of refinement is, this doesn't look like much. Everything's dark. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a game object, and it's going to be a directional light. So once I get a directional light inside the scene, everything starts to illuminate. The other thing that's going to help kind of place some context, like right now, and I'll just focus on the game tab, so I'll get this back to its default setup, and I'll hit the play button. In looking around, there's not a whole lot of contrast between the water and the sky. And so what I want to do is I want to import a skybox and apply a sky into the environment. It's going to give me a lot of contrast. It's going to look much more interesting. And this is a relatively simple thing to do. So the first thing I want to do to introduce a sky into the equation is inside my standard assets, I should have a Skybox folder. And if I don't have that available, I can go to Assets, Import Package, and choose Skyboxes. And what I need to do is I need to drag that into the renderer. Now, the easiest way to do this is to go to the Edit pull-down menu and choose Render Settings. And once I bring up Render Settings, if I look over here in the inspector, it gives us access to renders, things that happen at render time. So there's different kinds of effects, and what I want to focus on is that there's a skybox material here. Now I have two ways of loading a skybox. One, I could just click on the little bullet next to the field, and I could choose an appropriate skybox from this list. But what Unity does is it provides you anything that is of the same graphic type that can be applied to the sky. So not all of these are appropriate skybox textures. In fact, if I look here, I see bush, and it would definitely give me an interesting effect, but not what I'm looking for. So an easier way to kind of filter out all of this stuff, unless you know exactly which skybox you want to use based on name, the easiest thing to do is to determine which skybox you want to use here by selecting the skybox folder, and in one motion, click and drag. And I'll just, for now, I'll use Sunny 2. And I want to click and drag. This is all one motion. We don't want to release until we get to the no material field that's in line with the skybox material. And once I release that, now I have a skybox. Okay, and that's basically a 6-image cube that's placed inside our environment, so that when we hit play, we can look around and we can see our sky. So that provides a lot of contrast with the horizon line, gives us a little bit more context, and it feels a little bit more appropriate. So I'll toggle the play button off one more time. And again, that workflow is Edit, Render Settings, which brings up the inspector property here. And again, if you click one time on one of these skyboxes, you're going to lose focus, because what that will do is it will show you the inspector for that element. So as I single click around here, it's giving me a preview of what the 6 different images are that make up any given skybox. But what I want to do is go to Edit, Render Settings. Once I determine which skybox I want to use, I want to click and drag and only release once I get to that skybox material field. And again, alternatively, what you can do is just click on this bullet and search specifically for the name that you want to use. So in this case, I wanted to use one of the sunny skyboxes, which is listed here. And so I could choose one of these here. And you can see actually I'm getting a real-time preview here, which is kind of cool. Starry Night. So there we go. So once that's selected, I can close that. And now I have a skybox in my scene, and that'll help provide a lot of context. So in the next presentation, I'm going to refine my island a little bit and start to include some of the mountains and the topology, and we'll take a closer look at some of the other tools that are available inside the terrain editor. We'll do that in the next presentation.